I know this weekend could ostensibly be one of the most divisive weekends at Westside as Arkansas Tech played Harding University in football. I'm curious just to kind of see how many in here are students or alumni of Arkansas Tech. Can I see your hands? All right, got some Wonder Boys and I can't remember what they call the ladies in that one. There you go, Golden Sons. Yeah. How many are students or went to at one time Harding University? And my hand goes up on that one. See, that's a fairly divisive. We're evenly divided, and I'm guessing some of you have allegiances in both directions. And so this football game was difficult. I don't have anything here. The football game was difficult. It was a good game. I listened to it on the way back from my family. I was visiting my family in Northeast Arkansas. Listened to it on the way back, and Harding won 3 quarters. And then the fourth quarter, it didn't go so well. What happened, Jake? A 2-touchdown. Anyway. You know, I thought probably I should have brought a sweatshirt and worn. Maybe next year we can kind of work that out. That whoever wins has to wear the other sweatshirt. So hopefully, I don't know, we'll see a better result for Harding next year. But congratulations this year to Arkansas Tech and their dramatic come from behind victory yesterday. It was, regardless of which side you were rooting for, it was a great game. That was a really exciting game, and I enjoyed listening to it. Glad I could get it on the radio because I wasn't able to be there in person. Beyond divisiveness and the divisiveness of football, as it sometimes brings, I'm wearing my Big Ten tie this morning. I know. I'm asking for it. And it can be pretty divisive. And I enjoy talking about it. I enjoy joking and doing that little trash talk thing that we do with people from other teams, other conferences, and that kind of a thing. But when it comes to something like discipleship, there can be no controversy. There can only be a single-minded focus on what we are to do. I'm going to hand this back to you. Okay, great. It's going all kinds of crazy on me. The lesson series we've been going through, really enjoyed our study of the book of Luke, and I hope that you have too, as we go through that gospel looking to ask the question that he asked, why Jesus? It's as if he's asking his contemporaries, his Greek contemporaries, to just consider this man Jesus. They had a lot of considerations back then, a lot of gods that they could worship, a lot that they could sacrifice to, a lot of different deities that they could serve and try to ask for these deities to grant them favor, to grant them wishes. And Luke and the other gospel writers, the apostles that existed in those days, and those who have gone forth since as representatives of Christ and Christians, have asked the world to consider this Jesus. And they in return asked them and now ask us, why? Why Jesus? We have so many other gods, so many other deities, so many other philosophies that offer any number of things. Why Jesus? Why should we care? And why should we worship him to the exclusion of all others? Last week, for Luke's answer, we looked to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And his answer there was because Jesus was a God who demonstrated in his time on earth extraordinary compassion. And that he certainly did. Today, we look at Jesus as he tells his followers of his upcoming death, that he is about to go to his death in the near future. And he warns that there might be a cost in following him. And so the answer as we look at why Jesus this morning is because Jesus was willing to pay an enormous price for us and in our behalf. We've spent a lot of time in this last series talking about things like Jesus' love, Jesus' compassion. We've talked about his ministry to the poor and his heart for the common man. All of those things are so true, and all of those things are compelling reasons to follow Jesus. And in fact, our world as they look at Christianity and as they look at Jesus and why we follow him, we get a wide acceptance of how they get that Jesus was a compelling figure, that he was a good man. In fact, we have a lot of people out there who say, even though they're not Christians, that they really respect Jesus and what he stood for. But Jesus didn't just call people to respect him. He didn't just call people to like the fact that he served the poor and that he healed the sick. He called people to follow him as his disciples. And he warned that there's a cost to that. There's a cost for being his disciple. Some of you have read Kyle Idleman's book, Not a Fan. And you remember the model that he gives in that book of someone who is either a fan at a sporting event or someone who's on the field playing. And the difference between the two. The fan sitting back and admiring what's going on the field, but never getting down there to play in the game. But those who play in the game have skin in the game. They have something on the line. They have something that they can either gain reputation for or lose reputation for. And while the fan can look on with very little engagement, thinking about what's going to happen and eating their popcorn, the player can't do that. The player has to take it very seriously. On Wednesday nights in one class, the adult class that I teach, we've been studying this book. It's a book called The Cost of Discipleship, written by a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer back in the late 1930s. And during the time that the times that he wrote was extraordinary. They were extraordinary times by an extraordinary individual. His philosophy, his perspective on things was not all that unusual. He was a conservative theologian. He was an academic, someone who had spent a lot of time studying Scripture and studying the inner workings of Christian history, and particularly as it pertains to Martin Luther and some of the things that he had done. Being a German Christian, most German Christians were considered Lutherans at that point in time, and that's what Bonhoeffer would have considered himself. But as the party of National Socialism began to take their hold on the country, some things began to change within the Lutheran Church, but also within Christianity at that point in time in that nation. Because National Socialism, or the Nazi Party, put their fingers into everything. And everything was adjusted to align with the government perspective on things. And the church was certainly no different. A lot of people, when they look at what Bonhoeffer was about and what he did, they ask the question, or, well, not necessarily Bonhoeffer, but the Germans at that point in time, why didn't anybody speak out against the government? Why didn't they talk about what was going on? Why was there not a public outcry? And the answer is, of course, if you look into it, that there was an outcry. But it was largely squashed by the government, who had a reign of fear, a reign of terror amongst their own people. Bonhoeffer was one of the ones who was outspoken. And being a pastor, being a theologian, he was someone that the government had to handle a little more carefully because of the outcry that it might cause if something were to be done to him. But they knew, and they had targeted him as an active opponent of their government and of the kinds of things that they were trying to do. Alternately, they considered him to be somewhat compliant, but also they considered him to be a revolutionary, someone who was trying to start something. And they were keeping their eye on him, on his writings, and on what he did. This book, The Cost of Discipleship, was a bold thing to write during that time. And as we've read through this book in our Wednesday night class, we've taken note often of how bold it was for him to write some of the things that he wrote, given the context that he was writing it in. And in all of it, he's calling Christians in Germany to stand up. There was a great persecution going. Comply with what the government wishes, and the government had made their wishes known even in the church context. Comply with that, or there's going to be consequences. And sometimes, as we now know, those consequences were extreme, were horrible. And so most people would comply. Bonhoeffer stood apart as being different. He did not comply. And he asked others to quietly revolt against this idea of the Nazi government, against what they were striving to do, against this idea that a race or a nation was just better than everybody else because of who they are and where they came from. Bonhoeffer viewed everything in terms of Christ and what Christ meant Christ's love, of Christ's outreach, of his compassion, and of his care. But he called Christians to be disciples, to be a visible community, even in a situation where that lifestyle was unhealthy or unsafe. And again, in Germany, it certainly was. Some of the most famous parts of his book, The Cost of Discipleship, have to do with his contrast between cheap grace and costly grace. He talks about cheap grace as being a grace that you take because you think it's going to cover everything. It's a grace that allows you to continue living your life the way you want to and do what you want to do. Trusting that, hey, this grace is just going to cover everything, all the mistakes that I make. I'm going to live my life the way I want to, and thank God I can live it the way I want to, because where I mess up, where I make bad decisions, where I make poor choices and harm others, he's just going to forgive me. But Bonhoeffer says grace was never intended to be cheap. Grace had a price. Grace cost Jesus his very life so that he could offer that grace to us. And if we live grateful, thankful lives for what Jesus has done for us, it's going to come at a cost. It's going to be grace that's costly. Yes, we use it. Yes, we need it. Yes, it has to be a part of our lives, but we need to take great care that we're trying to please and serve the one who made it possible. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus talks about this idea, this cost of being a disciple of his, what it's going to cost folks who want to come and follow him. And it's an interesting place that Luke puts this statement, because in this part of the book of Luke, things are going swimmingly well for Jesus and his disciples. Things are going great. He sends out the 12 in the first part of the passage, and they come back saying things are going extraordinarily well. People received our message. Everybody likes us, and they like what they have to say. And then Jesus goes about to feed the 5,000. People come to hear him, even though they're trying to find some time alone. People come to hear him. They listen to what he has to say. The disciples encourage him to send people to their homes because it's getting late in the day. And Jesus looks at them and says, no, you feed them. And of course, thinking as we would and as humans normally would, how in the world are we going to feed this crowd? And Jesus instructs them to sit down in groups of 50 and pass out the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And they did, and the crowd ate and had their fill. Again, that had to be a triumphant moment. Had to be something where they were excited to be followers of Jesus. Can you believe what he's done? The radical acceptance that we've had from the common man. This Jesus has given us acceptance, and we're moving forward, and they believed in their minds, they saw the end being this kingdom that was going to be a grassroots kind of movement that God was going to be with, and that was going to push the Romans out and allow the Jews to have their independent state again, one that was welcome on the world stage and one that was powerful. Jesus was going to be at the head of that, they believed. And they would be there serving with him at his right-hand side. They would be powerful and influential. But as they're thinking this, Jesus undoubtedly perceiving their thoughts, Jesus makes the statement that some of them had to have given them a double take. Well, first he asked them, listen, who are the people saying that I am? And they said, well, they think you're one of the prophets, Moses or Elijah, or somebody that's come back from the dead. And you're reincarnated. He says, who do you think that I am? And Peter said, oh, I know who you are. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the one that we've been waiting for. And again, in the Jewish expectation in their minds, it meant you're the one that's going to come and rescue us from all of this. You're going to set up your own kingdom on the throne of David, and we're all going to reign right there with you. And Jesus said, well, don't tell anybody this. But I got to tell you, it's not going to be like you think. You see, and then he makes the statement that Robin read earlier for us. I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. And I'm going to be killed in a cruel way, and then on the 3rd day I'll be raised to life. I don't know, but I got to think that kind of a statement, you probably could have heard crickets if there are any out there. Because that was not what they were thinking. That wasn't the way in their minds they saw this whole thing ending, not with a horrible death. And so when Jesus told them this, and we get the sense later on in the passage as he tells them this, that they just don't know what to think about it. He must be speaking metaphorically, but what could he possibly mean by that? And I got to think that kind of a pronouncement, the idea that he's going to die someday, he's going to be killed by the chief priests, by the rulers of their people, had to have had them thinking, how in the world could that possibly happen? And as Jesus sees their faces, realizes what might be going through their minds, what must be going through their minds, he says, listen, if you want to follow me, it's not about what you want, it's about what I want. Deny yourself. Take up your cross daily and follow me. If you want to save your life, you better lose it. Or you will lose it. But if you want to lose your life, if you lose your life on my account, then you'll save it. It's a statement, again, that had to have been sobering among the disciples. One that must have caused them, even at times, to reconsider what they're doing, following this man who's predicting his own death. But of course, that can't be true. Can't be what he's all about. Yeah, we know, looking backwards, that it was exactly what he meant. He meant exactly what he said. He was predicting accurately the events that would unfold just a few months, a few years in the future. That he would be persecuted, that he would be pursued by those who were his enemies, that he would be captured, and that he would be killed. When he talks about taking up your cross, it had to have produced an interesting mental imagery, one that would have been familiar with Jews, and particularly Jews who lived in and around Jerusalem. You see, it wasn't uncommon in those days for revolutionaries to get their ideas about becoming this Messiah. There were several who felt they had this call from God, and they would look at it as a military call. And they would gather people about them, and they would speak in private places and call crowds together, saying, we've got to do something about these Romans who are occupying our territory. We've got to make a start, and if it's going to start with us. And the crowds would cheer. And he would say, are you with me? Yes, we're with you. And they would go about stealing weapons and collecting things, and they would gather momentum. Their movement would gather momentum in this real grassroots kind of way, and they would all come together and plan some kind of an event where they would begin their revolution. But in the history of Jerusalem, again and again and again, this kind of thing was tried. And it's why they kept a large military regiment. The Romans kept a large military regiment in and around Jerusalem, because they knew this kind of thing was going to be a regular occurrence. It was. And so they would take up their swords, and usually at night they would rush into the town, claiming victory for Israel, claiming to be this Messiah who would lead, calling everyone to follow them, getting the crowd up in arms, and then they would go and start to attack the Romans and start to try to drive them from the city. But the Romans were far superior militarily, and they would squash every time this movement, this military action. It wouldn't last very long. Most of the time, only a couple of sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes maybe a couple of days, but it didn't last very long. And the Romans always emerged from those conflicts victorious. But what happened to the leader? See, they always wanted the leader. They always wanted the one who started the action. They probably had heard rumors about who it was, rumors about what was going to happen. Some people were telling them they had spies like everybody else did. They knew who it was and what he was trying to do, and if they didn't catch him that day, they'd try to find him. And it was interesting that all of those people who were proclaiming their support of him, yes, we'll follow you, yes, we'll die with you, yes, we'll come with you to the very end, would throw down their weapons and blend in with the crowd. Oh, we see it happening on the world stage now, right? With these kinds of grassroots movements that have taken place, especially in the Middle East. When the dominant military force comes into the lands, they throw down their guns and step back on the curb. They're dressed like everybody else. They blend in pretty well. Oh, no, that gun wasn't mine. I had nothing to do with this. We're just watching. And that's what was going on back then. That's what would happen back then. They would take a step back, except for the very few who were the most dedicated behind that leader. And those very few would be corralled with him. They would be tried before the military tribunal with him, and all of them would be sentenced to death. Sometimes it was a very few, sometimes it could be hundreds that were sentenced to death. In fact, there were times when crosses lined the roads coming into Jerusalem with the impaled bodies of these revolutionaries on them, as the Romans want to send a message: if you want to try this, this is how you're going to end up. And so the image of someone taking up their cross and following a leader was one that certainly wasn't very popular. When you were carrying your cross through Jerusalem, it meant that your leader had been defeated, that he was done, that his was a failed movement. It was finished, and people were moving on. But Jesus says, you can't be, if you're going to be my disciple, you can't be among those who are going to drop your weapons and step back. Or in using the metaphor, who are going to drop your faith, who are going to drop your lifestyle and step back and blend in with the culture. You can't be among those. If you're going to be my disciple, you better be one of those who, when the day comes, when I'm being carried off, when I'm being led off to my death, I better see you right there in line behind me. You better be the one to step up and say, yeah, I was with him. And when they hand you a cross, you fall in line behind me and march uphill. That's the kind of disciple I want. Not someone who's going to shrink back, but someone who's going to step up. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. What does that mean? Put myself last, right? I empty myself of who I am and what I am, and I fill myself up with him. My will is his will. My wants, my desires, my hope becomes his wants, his desires, his hopes. Because as a disciple, it's not about me and my good and my well-being. It's about him and his good and his well-being. It's pushing his thoughts forward, his cause forward, his teachings forward, not mine. Disciple must deny themselves. They must take up their cross. And Luke adds an interesting qualifier there. He says, must take up their cross daily and follow him. One way you look at it, that could mean he must be willing to do it on a daily kind of basis, willing to take up that cross and carry it through the streets on a daily kind of basis. Another way we could take that or interpret that is Luke saying, you better be willing to live that visible life, that life that clearly shows that you're a follower of Christ, metaphorically bearing that cross and walking behind him each and every day. So that when people see you, they see that you're a follower of his, and they know that's exactly who you are each and every day. Anyone who would come after me must deny themselves, must take up their cross daily. And then last he says, follow me. I remember walking with my dad in the woods sometimes when I was a young boy. And especially if there was a heavy snow on the ground, it was difficult to follow him. His legs were a lot longer. His legs are still longer than mine. Then they were a lot longer than mine. And it was hard to keep up and hard to follow. But I found that if I could follow him in heavy snow, I could try to put my feet in the place where his feet had been. He had already broken through the snow. He had already done the hard part. He had already done that work, and so that I could just place my foot in the steps where he had been and follow him. When I'm doing that, I have no choice on where I'm going to go, right? It's not up to my decision. It's not up to my will as I'm following in his footsteps. I'm just placing my foot in the next step, going exactly in the direction and in the place that he has gone. And that's the kind of following that we're called to do. That if we follow Jesus, if we claim to be followers of his, we too must deny ourselves, must be willing to take up our cross daily, and must follow him. I got to tell you, when I read those words, I find them to be strong. If you'd advance it to the next slide, please. When I read those words, I find them to be strong. I find them to be difficult. The idea of emptying myself of my will, of being a very visible Christian, of living my life following Him with that, bearing that cross daily and following Him every step of the way. It's a difficult chore. It's not just difficult because of my will, because I believe I'm one of those people who want to do that. But it's difficult because of my flesh. I find I can't always do that. I find I make mistakes. I have setbacks. I lose battles with temptation. And because of that, I leave myself like Jesus must have found himself sometimes, just shaking my head. Him at his disciples and those who are following him, and me at me. At the end of Luke chapter 9, we see how Jesus handles some people who offer to follow him. Jesus seems to out them. In those last three, you remember someone, he says, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, saying, listen, I don't think you can handle the homeless part, because that's what I am. I'm homeless. And I don't think you can handle that. Another man, Jesus says, follow me. And the man says, well, first let me go back and bury my father. And again, what he's saying there is probably not that his father has already died, but he's probably saying that his father is towards the end of his life, and he wants to be there to take care of him. And that was a Jewish man's responsibility. He was supposed to do that. I want to be there and take care of him, and once he passes away, then I can come and join you. But Jesus says, no time for that. Let the dead bury their own dead. In other words, those things will take care of themselves. You proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. You talk about the kingdom. And yet another man wants to follow him. But he says, first, let me go back and say goodbye to my family. And Jesus says, no time for that. If you're going to follow me, it's about following me. You separate from family, and you do what I've asked you to do. And again, in his gospel, Luke is saying following Jesus is an all-in commitment. It's something that takes everything. Matthew talks about these parables of the buried treasure and of the pearl of great price, wherein when people see them, and he says the kingdom is like these, when people see that, they're ready to get rid of everything, sell everything they have so that they can take possession of these extremely valuable things. Jesus is saying the kingdom is like that. That if you want to come, it's going to cost you everything. And here's some other news. Everything you have, if you total that up in terms of what it's worth, doesn't even come close to what you're going to get. And yet people need to be willing to lay it all on the line. Everything. You see, Jesus doesn't prefer those who want to turn back to their families or turn back and take care of other responsibilities. Jesus loves his other disciples who, when he says, follow me, they left their nets on the beach. They left their accounting books on the table. They left their family, their friends, their social groups, their jobs, and says, yes, Jesus, I'll follow you, and I'll do it right now. You see, even today, it's easy to admire Jesus, but being a disciple is more difficult. Just like back in the days of Nazi Germany, just like back in the days of Jesus under the Roman occupation, following Jesus had to be done in a very visible way, a way that was seen. And your acceptance, how you're perceived by your culture, is defined by how your culture perceives Jesus. If you live somewhere where it's very, very openly welcome to be a follower of Christ, it's going to be easy in a lot of ways. If you live in a place, and the places that we live are more and more like this, where following Jesus is negatively viewed by your culture, then you will be negatively viewed. Because either way, it doesn't matter what culture thinks. Our job, our responsibility is to live in a visible way so that they can see us for who we are and for what we are. And as they see us, they see Jesus. Ours is not to interpret his sayings, his commands, and his wishes for culture. It's simply to communicate them. It's not to look at what Jesus said and say, well, that's not how it's done in our culture. Maybe how it's done in our culture is a better way of looking at it. It's just a way of, ours is just to love them and to tell them what Jesus wants them to do. And however they perceive it, they perceive it. You see, again, loving Jesus and appreciating him, admiring him is one thing, but following him is another. There are going to be hardships. There are going to be times where it's difficult. There are going to be relationships where we have to choose that relationship or our relationship with Christ. There are going to be temptations. There are going to be opportunities to leave, to shrink back, to drop our weapons and fall away. But Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. As we think in terms of what we offer to Jesus, it's kind of interesting because we want to hold these things that we consider to be ours, our possessions, our family, our will, everything. We want to kind of hold on to that. We have a difficult time giving it up, and yet I got to think at the end we're going to look at that and see all of that was His anyway. He's only asking us to remand to Him what is His and give Him what is His. In fact, there's only one thing, and I want you to think about this morning. There's only one thing that we have that wasn't His from the beginning. And it's only ours because He gave it to us. And He could take it if He wanted to, but He doesn't. He gave it to us. He gave it to you and He gave it to me. That one thing is our will. Is our decision as to whether we're going to in this life serve me or serve Him. That's our will. That's the one thing that we have that He won't take from us. Everything else was always His from the beginning. It was His before we got here. It'll be His after we leave. The only one thing we have is that choice. Do I follow me or do I follow Him? And if I follow Him, I need to be among those who deny myself, take up my cross each day, and follow Him. It's discouraging sometimes when I think of my own service and how well I've done at every day taking up my cross and following Him. It's why sometimes I'm thankful for these disciples, because in the rest of Luke chapter 9, he talks about all of these wonderful things that happened under Jesus, about how Jesus challenged them with this call to discipleship. But it also mentions that in chapter 9 that the disciples botch a healing. They try to heal a young man that had an evil spirit and they weren't able to do it. And Jesus said, how long am I going to put up with you all? In another place, they're fighting over who's the greatest. Right there in the chapter where they say, you're the Christ. Right there in the chapter where He says, I'm going to die, but I need you to follow me. I need you to take up your cross and follow me. They're fighting over who's going to be the greatest. And then in the passage just before He again predicts His second death and talks about this cost of discipleship, the disciples try to enter a Samaritan village to stay for the night. But when they find out that Jesus and His disciples are heading to Jerusalem, the Samaritans refuse to let them in. And the Bible says James and John looked at each other and they looked at Jesus and says, Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? What? I mean, really, I got to think in that situation, you wonder if Jesus was just trying to hold on to the rage or whether He laughed. What is it about what I've been doing that makes you think that would be feasible? That'd be what I'd want to do. No. I'd love to know what else I'd love to know what He said there. The Bible just says He rebuked them and they went on. It'd be interesting to hear that conversation, really. But these same men who Jesus was training to follow Him, these same men that Jesus would hand over the reins of His mission later on after He passed away and went up into heaven, these same men who started the church and who carried it through, who spread the gospel to the entire world at that time, struggled just like I do. They didn't get it. They made mistakes. They were succumbed to the temptation of glorifying themselves. They were wrestling with that choice of who am I going to follow, just like I do. Thank God for those disciples. Thank God that the Bible shows me that they struggle with this just like I struggle with it. That it's hard for them just like it's hard for us. And yet they persevered. They stuck to it. You know, the first opportunity they had to pick up their cross and follow Jesus, literally, what happened? They were gone, weren't they? They disappeared. Don't think they didn't notice that later on. Don't think that as they're remembering these words of Jesus, they're also remembering the fact that when He was walking up that road to die on the cross, He did it alone. And yet later on in their lives, each of them, with the exception of John, walked their own road. Each of them faced an executioner. Each of them was killed for his dedication and determination in the cause of Jesus. Now, I don't know where that's going to happen, whether that's going to happen in our world or not. I don't know whether it's going to get so bad in our lifetimes that we literally have that proverbial gun to our heads or sword to our necks that says, deny Jesus or die. I suppose it could happen. We see places in the world where it is happening. And yet my dedication, my hope, my commitment is to be the kind of follower that when that day comes, that I'll bear that cross and that I'll walk that road behind my master and be willing to give my life just like he did for me. I encourage you to do that too. Consider that this discipleship thing is costly, but also consider that whatever it costs, it's nowhere near what it's worth. That the home that we'll have in heaven one day, where we'll serve God forever and be in his presence forever, is worth far beyond whatever it costs us here on earth. I ask you to count the cost, but I ask you to come. Come to his love. Come to his forgiveness. Come to his grace and mercy and allow him to transform you every day into the disciple that he wants you to be. We'll have people around the room to pray with you if you have prayer requests this morning or would like to have someone pray with you about your walk before him. My wife and some of the other leaders of the wives and folks who are leaders of the congregation are going to be in the back. If you're a woman and would rather pray with a woman, you can go out into the lobby and do that. But whatever your need is this morning, if you want to put on Christ and begin this walk of discipleship, we want to do that with you today too. Whatever your need might be, Zach's going to sing a song to encourage you, and we ask you to respond, and we're going to stand and sing it.